In the city of Tangier, on the northern edge of Morocco, the waves of the Atlantic roll endlessly onto the shore. The salty wind carries the voices of sailors, the cries of gulls, and the quiet prayers of fishermen who rise before dawn. It was here, in this meeting place of sea and land, that a boy named Muhammad ibn Abdullah al-Lawati al-Tanji was born. The world would later know him simply as Ibn Battuta. From his earliest days, he listened to the stories of travelers who came and went. Merchants from Africa spoke of gold and ivory. Sailors from the East spoke of India, its spices and jewels. Pilgrims on their way to Mecca told of the holy sanctuary, the Kaaba, and the city of Medina, where the Prophet rested. For a young mind, these stories were seeds of dreams, and in time they grew into a desire too strong to ignore. By the year 1325, Ibn Battuta was 21 years old. He had studied law and religion, but his heart was restless. He longed not only to fulfill his duty as a pilgrim, but also to see with his own eyes the vast world he had only heard described. One morning after prayer, he made his decision. He would leave Tangier, alone, and begin the long road to Mecca. His family was saddened, for he was their only son. But he comforted them with faith. "I may travel without kin beside me," he said, "but God is with me, and he will be my guide." With that he prepared his modest supplies, some food, a small purse of money, and a heart full of determination. On the day of departure he walked down to the sea. The waves struck the rocks, white foam rising with each crash. He looked back at the city, its whitewashed houses, its narrow streets, the minarets reaching into the sky. Then he looked east, toward lands unseen. The air was cool, yet heavy with the weight of farewell. He took a long breath and began his first steps into the unknown. The journey carried him across the northern coast of Africa. He traveled by foot, sometimes on horseback, sometimes with caravans that moved slowly through the dust. In Algeria he saw fortified towns. In Tunis he marveled at markets filled with fabrics, fruit, and spices. That night he sat by the fire with other pilgrims, sharing bread and water, and listening to the wind sweep across the dunes. Yet the road was harsh. The sun burned his skin, and the endless sand disoriented even the most experienced guides. There were days when water was scarce, when each sip had to be rationed carefully. But then, like a miracle, an oasis would appear, a cluster of palms, a pool of clear water, and the sound of birds singing above. Such moments restored hope and reminded the weary travelers that God's mercy was never far away. In Tunis, Ibn Battuta found a large caravan of pilgrims preparing for the East. He joined them gladly, for there is safety in numbers. The caravan was like a moving village. Camels carried sacks of grain and jars of water. Children played between the animals. Women cooked simple meals over small fires. Men recited prayers at dawn and dusk, and conversations filled the long hours of walking. Day after day the desert stretched before them. Golden dunes by day, cold winds by night. Sometimes silence reigned, broken only by the soft pads of camel feet. Other times, voices rose in song, lifting spirits and pushing tired bodies forward. Through it all, Ibn Battuta observed with keen eyes, recording in his heart the details of every step. One night, as the caravan rested, Ibn Battuta lay on the sand and looked up. The sky was a dome of stars, so clear that it seemed the heavens were leaning close. He whispered to himself, "How vast is this world, and how small I am within it. Yet God has chosen me to walk this path. He realized that his journey was not only across land and sea, but also deep within his own soul. He thought of Tangier, of his parents and their prayers for him. He missed them, but he also felt a strong pull forward, a sense that the road ahead held wonders beyond imagination. Slowly his eyes closed, and he drifted into sleep with the sound of the desert wind around him. Thus ended the first stage of his voyage. A young man had left his home, carrying only faith and determination, and had begun the journey that would one day make his name immortal. Ahead lay cities, empires, oceans, and stories beyond counting. For now, beneath the stars, he rested, while the world waited for him to discover it. The caravan pressed onward, leaving the city of Tunis behind. Ibn Battuta traveled with fellow pilgrims, men and women from many lands, all united by one goal, to reach the house of God in Mecca. The desert stretched before them, wide and merciless. Days were long, and the sun burned with unrelenting fire. At night, the winds grew cold, carrying the sound of the shifting dunes. The road passed through Tripoli, then through the land of Barca. The faces of strangers became familiar as the journey wore on. There was comfort in shared hardship, sharing water, sharing stories, and sharing silence when words felt too heavy. At last the caravan entered Egypt. Suddenly the land changed. No longer empty desert, but fields of green. The Nile spread its blessing, giving life to everything around it. Ibn Battuta stood on its banks in wonder. He saw boats gliding along the water, farmers tending their crops, and villages alive with children's laughter. After the dry expanse of sand, the sight of such abundance filled him with awe. Then came Cairo, the great city, heart of Egypt. Its streets overflowed with people, its markets filled with treasures from across the world. Spices, fabrics, perfumes, and books, all were traded under the watchful eyes of merchants. Minarets rose above the rooftops, and the sound of the call to prayer echoed across the city. Ibn Battuta visited the Mosque of Al-Azhar, where students gathered around their teachers. Lamps hung from high ceilings, and the murmur of voices carried through the halls. He listened with care, eager to learn, and he marveled at the grandeur of the place. But the journey did not end in Cairo. The caravan moved southward, toward the Red Sea. Ibn Battuta followed, passing through desert once more, until he reached the port of Aidab. There, wooden ships waited with sails furled, ready to carry pilgrims across the waters. The voyage was uneasy. The sea was restless, and the ships rocked under the weight of wind and wave. Ibn Battuta prayed quietly, asking God to grant them safe passage. Days later, the shore of Arabia appeared. They landed at Jeddah, tired yet filled with joy. The sacred destination was close. From Jeddah, the road to Mecca was lined with pilgrims. Every step was heavy with anticipation. Ibn Battuta's heart raced as the holy city drew near. Then, at last, the Kaaba stood before him, the ancient house, covered in its black cloth, surrounded by worshippers circling in prayer. His eyes filled with tears. He joined the crowd, walking slowly, his lips whispering thanks. After completing the pilgrimage, he traveled to Medina. There, in the Prophet's mosque, he stood in reverence at the resting place of the Messenger of God. His soul felt at peace. The dream that had begun in Tangier had now reached its first great fulfillment. But deep within, Ibn Battuta knew this was only the beginning. of a far greater journey. After the peace of Mecca and the blessings of Medina, Ibn Battuta felt his heart urging him onward. His pilgrimage was complete, yet his journey had only just begun. He decided to continue eastward, seeking not only new lands, but also knowledge, experience, and the company of scholars. He left the holy cities behind and traveled northward, crossing stretches of desert and rugged hills. Days passed in slow rhythm, the crunch of camel feet, the whisper of wind, the soft calls to prayer echoing across the barren land. Each evening, when the caravan stopped, he would sit quietly, listening to the desert silence. His path brought him first to Damascus. The city lay cradled by orchards and flowing rivers, a jewel of the Levant. Ibn Battuta marveled at its gardens, rows of fruit trees heavy with figs and pomegranates, water channels glistening in the sun. The scent of jasmine drifted through the air. For a traveler who had crossed endless stretches of sand, Damascus seemed a paradise. In the heart of the city stood the great mosque of the Umayyads. Its vast courtyards echoed with the footsteps of worshippers, its walls adorned with mosaics that shimmered like gold in the sunlight. Here, Ibn Battuta listened to sermons, joined the prayers, and admired the devotion of the people. He felt the weight of centuries in the stones of that ancient place. From Damascus, he journeyed eastward to Baghdad. Once the shining capital of the Abbasid caliphs, the city had suffered under the Mongol invasions. Yet even in decline, Baghdad retained a spark of its old brilliance. Minarets still rose above crowded streets. Scholars still gathered in mosques and schools, debating law, philosophy, and science. Markets overflowed with textiles, books, and spices. Ibn Battuta walked along the banks of the Tigris River, imagining the days when poets, scientists, and caliphs had made Baghdad the envy of the world. Though scars remained, he saw resilience in the faces of its people. The city was wounded, but it was not broken. After some time in Baghdad, Ibn Battuta pressed further east, entering Persia. The land stretched before him in wide plains and high mountains. Caravanserais lined the roads, stone inns that offered weary travelers shelter and food. There he met merchants from distant lands, carrying silk, gems, and stories from places even he had not yet seen. In Isfahan, he admired the grand mosques with their high domes and graceful arches. The markets were filled with carpets woven in intricate patterns, silk dyed in brilliant colors, and pottery painted with delicate designs. He saw craftsmen at their work, shaping beauty with their hands. Further south, in Shiraz, he discovered another treasure: poetry. The city was home to men of letters who recited verses beneath the shade of gardens. Streams of water flowed between rows of trees, nightingales sang in the branches, and the voices of poets rose into the air. Ibn Battuta listened with wonder. These were not just words, but melodies that spoke to the heart. Everywhere he went, he sought out scholars. He asked questions, exchanged ideas, and absorbed what he could. For him, travel was not only about seeing new lands, but also about gathering knowledge. Each conversation, each observation, was another page in the great book of his life. As he looked ahead, he felt a growing pull toward the east. India, with its powerful kings and vast riches, called to him. He had heard tales of its elephants, its palaces, and its gardens beyond imagining. The road to India was long, but Ibn Battuta had already learned that distance was no barrier to a determined heart. And so, as he left Persia behind, He carried with him memories of gardens, markets, and the voices of poets. Yet he knew that the greatest wonders still lay before him. The horizon stretched wide, and he was ready to follow wherever it led. From Persia, the road turned once again toward the sea. Ibn Battuta heard countless tales of India, its kings, its palaces, its elephants, its wealth beyond imagination. The stories painted a land of marvels, and his heart grew restless to see it for himself. He joined a group of merchants and pilgrims who were sailing east. Their wooden ship carried silks, spices, and hopes across the waters of the Arabian Sea. At first the voyage was calm. The sun rose each morning like a golden coin, and the horizon stretched wide and open. But the ocean is never predictable. Storms came without warning. Dark clouds gathered, the winds howled, and waves struck hard against the ship. Ibn Battuta clung to the deck, whispering prayers, until at last the storm passed and the waters grew calm again. After weeks of sailing, the coast of India appeared on the horizon. Palm trees lined the shore, and beyond them stretched green fields and colorful houses. The ship anchored at Calicut, a thriving port on the western coast. The air was rich with the scent of pepper and cinnamon. Markets buzzed with life. Merchants from Arabia, Persia, Africa, and China traded side by side. Piles of spices, silk, and gems glittered in the sunlight. Ibn Battuta walked through the marketplace, marveling at the mixture of faces and languages. From Calicut, he traveled inland toward Delhi, the capital of the Sultanate. The journey took him across rivers and forests, through villages alive with music and festivals. The land was fertile, watered by great rivers that stretched like veins across the countryside. He saw elephants carrying heavy loads, decorated with bright cloth and golden ornaments. Such animals, immense and powerful, were unlike anything he had seen before. When he entered Delhi, the grandeur of the city left him silent. Palaces stood with walls of stone and towers that touched the sky. Gardens spread wide, with fountains flowing and flowers blooming in perfect order. The Sultan of Delhi was a ruler of immense power and wealth, surrounded by courtiers, guards, and scholars. The Sultan welcomed Ibn Battuta warmly. Impressed by his knowledge of law and his travels, he appointed him as a judge in the royal court. For years, Ibn Battuta lived in Delhi, serving as a qadi, delivering judgments, and moving among the powerful and the wealthy. He saw the riches of the court, banquets filled with dishes of rice, meat, and sweets, dancers performing to the sound of drums, and poets reciting verses in Persian and Arabic. Yet even in the midst of such splendor, Ibn Battuta remained restless. His heart was not satisfied with comfort. The road still called to him. He listened to the stories of sailors who spoke of distant islands across the ocean, of kingdoms in the Maldives and Sri Lanka, of treasures hidden in tropical lands. In the evenings, he would sit alone in the gardens of Delhi. Lanterns glowed softly, water rippled through marble channels, and night breezes carried the scent of jasmine. He thought of the miles he had already crossed, and of the many more that awaited him. His time in India was only one chapter. Ahead lay oceans, islands, and mysteries that few men had ever seen. And so, even as he held a position of honor in the court of Delhi, Ibn Battuta's heart was already on the move. He knew that soon he would leave the comfort of palaces behind and sail once more into the unknown. After years in Delhi, Ibn Battuta's restless spirit grew stronger. Palaces and gardens could not hold him forever. He had heard tales of islands far out in the Indian Ocean, places where the sea shone turquoise, where coconut palms bent toward white sand, and where life followed a gentler rhythm. Those islands were the Maldives, and they would be his next destination. He boarded a ship once again, joining sailors and merchants who carried spices and cloth across the waters. The Indian Ocean was vast, and days at sea passed slowly, the horizon an endless circle of blue. At night, stars guided the sailors. Ibn Battuta prayed quietly beneath their light, his mind full of both anticipation and unease. At last the islands came into view. From the deck he saw small pieces of land scattered like emeralds upon the sea. Each island was crowned with palm trees. Villages of wooden huts stood close to the shore, boats tied in the shallows. The welcome was warm. The people of the Maldives greeted him with kindness, offering food and shelter. Soon word spread that he was a scholar and a judge. The islanders asked him to serve as Qadi, to settle disputes and guide them in matters of law. Ibn Battuta accepted. He lived among them, married, and learned their ways. The men fished from the ocean, the women wove fibers from coconut palms, and the children played freely along the beaches. Life was simple, and though resources were few, generosity was abundant. Yet even in paradise his restlessness returned. The world was wide, and the Maldives were but a pause along the way. He set his sights on another land across the ocean, Sri Lanka. The journey was shorter, yet the island felt vast and powerful. Mountains rose into misty skies. Rivers cut deep paths through green forests. Temples stood high upon sacred hills, and pilgrims came from many lands to climb them. Ibn Battuta joined them on the ascent of one great peak. Step by step he rose higher, until the land spread out beneath him in every direction. The air grew thin, and the view stretched farther than the eye could follow. Standing there, he felt both small and connected to the greatness of creation. Sri Lanka was rich in gems. In its markets, traders displayed sapphires and rubies, shining under the sun. Merchants from Arabia, China, and beyond came to bargain and carry treasures home. Ibn Battuta walked among them, listening to the chorus of voices in many languages, marveling at the meeting of so many cultures in one place. He stayed for months, meeting kings, traders, and common people. He ate their food, admired their landscapes, and observed their customs. But again, the call of the horizon stirred in his heart. He thought of the stories he had heard since youth, of China, the farthest of all lands, where silk and porcelain were born, where the cities were said to be larger than imagination, and the ships stronger than any on earth. One evening, by the side of a river in Sri Lanka, he sat in silence. The air was heavy with the scent of rain, and lanterns flickered in the dark. He whispered to himself, "The journey is not over. The road continues east." And with that thought, Ibn Battuta prepared once more to leave behind comfort and set sail toward the unknown. From the shores of Sri Lanka, Ibn Battuta set his eyes on the farthest horizon. For years he had heard tales of China, a land of silk and porcelain, of cities larger than imagination, of ships built stronger than any in the world. Now the chance to see it with his own eyes lay before him. The voyage across the Indian Ocean was long. Days at sea blended into nights under a canopy of stars. The waters were vast, and storms often came without warning. Dark clouds swallowed the horizon, winds roared and waves rose high against the wooden hulls. The sailors shouted orders, ropes strained, sails cracked. Ibn Battuta held tight and whispered prayers, knowing that every journey carried its risks. Yet each time the storm passed, the sea calmed, and the stars returned to guide them eastward. After weeks upon the water, the coastline of China appeared. Mountains loomed in the distance, forests stretched green and thick, and harbors bustled with ships far larger than those he had ever seen. Great junks, with multiple decks and tall sails, towered above the sea. Merchants loaded them with silk, spices, and porcelain, preparing to sail to distant lands. Ibn Battuta entered the port of Guangzhou. The city was alive with color and sound. Markets overflowed with goods, fine silk shimmering in the light, porcelain bowls painted with delicate designs, tea leaves packed in baskets, and strange fruits he had never seen before. Voices from many lands mingled: Chinese, Arab, Persian, and others unknown. The air itself seemed to hum with trade and energy. From Guangzhou he traveled further inland, reaching Kanbalik, the capital, known today as Beijing. The city stunned him. Streets ran wide and straight, guarded by soldiers in ordered ranks. Palaces rose with tiled roofs, carved dragons curling along their edges. Bridges spanned rivers, busy with carts and travelers. Everywhere he looked there was discipline, structure, and grandeur. Among these wonders, Ibn Battuta also sought the familiar. He found mosques built by Muslim merchants, blending Chinese and Islamic styles. He met communities of Muslims living far from their homelands, yet still holding firmly to their faith. Prayers rose in Arabic beneath roofs shaped by Chinese tradition. For Ibn Battuta, it was a sign of Islam's reach, stretching across oceans and cultures. He was impressed not only by the scale of the cities, but by the safety of the roads. Merchants traveled with little fear of theft. Guards kept watch over the highways, and laws were enforced with strict order. Here, he thought, is a land where trade and peace walk hand in hand. Months passed as he explored, learned and listened. He walked through markets, watched craftsmen at work, and spoke with scholars and merchants alike. He admired the balance of beauty and order, the harmony between people and their land. Yet even as he marveled, Ibn Battuta felt the weight of distance. He had traveled farther from Tangier than he had ever dreamed. The world was vast, but his heart began to long for home. He thought of the shores of Morocco, of his family, of the city where his journey had begun. One night, he sat beneath the Chinese sky, lanterns glowing softly around him. The stars above were the same ones he had seen in Tangier, in Mecca, in Baghdad. The thought comforted him. "The sky is one," he whispered, "and God is everywhere." His road had stretched across continents, but his soul remained guided by faith. China had given him marvels, yet it also reminded him of his own smallness in a great creation. Soon, he would turn west again. The deserts of Africa and the embrace of his homeland awaited. The long road was not yet finished, but the circle was beginning to close. After leaving the wonders of the Far East, Ibn Battuta turned his steps once more toward the lands of Africa. The call of the desert echoed in his mind, for he had heard stories of kingdoms across the Great Sahara, kingdoms rich in gold, trade, and faith. He longed to see them with his own eyes. The Sahara stretched before him like an endless ocean of sand. Days were marked by the blazing sun, nights by the cold breath of wind. Caravans crossed this vast emptiness slowly, each camel carrying loads of salt, grain, or water. Travelers moved together in silence, broken only by the rhythm of hooves pressing into the dunes. Ibn Battuta joined one of these caravans, his heart steady, his mind ready for the trials of the road. Life in the desert was harsh, water was precious, and every drop was guarded carefully. The sun burned without mercy, turning sand into a shimmering mirror. At night, stars glittered above, sharp and clear, reminding him of the guidance of heaven. Around small fires, travelers shared stories to ease their weariness. Some spoke of Timbuktu, others of the wealth of Mali, where gold was said to flow like water. Weeks of hardship led at last to the borders of the Mali Empire. Villages appeared along the riverbanks, mud brick houses clustered beneath the shade of palms. The people welcomed the travelers with generosity, offering food and water, greeting them with smiles. Ibn Battuta felt the warmth of hospitality even in this distant land. He visited the court of the king, a ruler of wealth and power. The throne room was simple yet dignified, with golden ornaments that reflected the kingdom's riches. The ruler listened with interest to Ibn Battuta's stories of faraway lands, of Mecca, of India, of China. In return, Ibn Battuta observed the customs of the court, the dignity of the ruler, and the respect of his people. In Timbuktu, he discovered a city alive with learning and trade. Scholars taught students beneath the shade of trees. Manuscripts of law and poetry spread before them. Merchants filled the markets with salt, ivory, and gold. Caravans arrived and departed, their lines of camels stretching far into the horizon. The air was thick with dust and voices, the pulse of commerce and knowledge beating strong. Ibn Battuta admired the faith of the people. Though their houses were simple and their clothes plain, their devotion was deep. They prayed with sincerity, welcomed strangers as brothers, and honored the path of learning. He saw in them a reflection of the wider Muslim world, connected not by walls or wealth, but by belief and kindness. Yet the desert remained a constant reminder of the fragility of life. On the return journey, Ibn Battuta looked out across the endless sand. He thought of the many lands he had crossed, from the gardens of Damascus to the palaces of Delhi, from the markets of Calicut to the harbors of China. And now, from the silence of the Sahara to the riches of Mali, he had witnessed the breadth of God's creation. Sitting on a dune at sunset, the horizon glowing red and gold, he whispered, "The journey teaches patience. The world is wide, yet faith binds it together." He felt both small and immense, small as one man among many, yet immense as a witness to wonders few had seen. The road through Africa had given him hardship, but also joy. It was another chapter in the story of a man who had left Tangier with nothing but determination and had found the world opening before him like a vast, endless book. Years had passed. Ibn Battuta had seen the holy cities of Arabia, the palaces of India, the harbors of China, and the markets of Africa. He had crossed seas, deserts, and mountains, and had walked through lands that most people only heard about in stories. Yet his heart at last began to turn westward, back to his home. The journey home was not swift. Caravans moved slowly, ships were delayed by storms, and roads stretched endlessly. But step by step, mile by mile, he drew nearer to Morocco. Along the way he passed through Egypt again, walking the busy streets of Cairo, and through the deserts of North Africa, where he once more saw the endless horizon of sand. Each place reminded him of earlier days, when he was younger, setting out full of curiosity. Now, he returned with years of experience and memories that filled his mind like a great library. Finally, the shores of Morocco came into view. The sea air was familiar. The white walls of Tangier rose against the sky, and the sight of home brought a deep calm to his heart. People welcomed him with joy. They had heard fragments of his story, whispers of the places he had been, but none had imagined the full measure of his travels. Soon his fame reached the Sultan of Morocco. The Sultan was eager to hear from a man who had walked through so many lands. He called Ibn Battuta to his court in Fez and asked him to recount his adventures. Ibn Battuta spoke, and the Sultan listened with wonder. To ensure that his words would not be lost, the Sultan commanded a scholar, Ibn Juzay, to write down every detail. And so, Ibn Battuta began to dictate. Day after day he sat with Ibn Juzay, speaking of deserts and rivers, cities and mountains, kings and scholars. He described the mosques of Damascus, the palaces of Delhi, the gardens of Shiraz, the ships of China, and the gold markets of Mali. Ibn Juzay wrote carefully, preserving each word, shaping them into a book that would survive long after both men were gone. The work was called Tufat al-Nuzar fi Garaib al-Amsar wa Ajaib al-Asfar, a gift to those who contemplate the wonders of cities and the marvels of traveling. To the world, it became known simply as the Rihla, the journey. It was more than a record of places. It was a mirror of the medieval world, seen through the eyes of one man who had walked across it. Ibn Battuta spent his later years in Morocco, no longer roaming but surrounded by those who wanted to hear his tales. Children gathered around him, eyes wide as he spoke of elephants, of faraway islands, of storms at sea. Scholars questioned him, eager for details of lands beyond their own. Merchants leaned in, curious about new markets and goods. His voice carried the rhythm of the road, and listeners felt as though they themselves were traveling with him. Though his body no longer crossed mountains and deserts, his words did. His stories traveled farther than his feet ever could, reaching ears across generations, across languages, across centuries. The boy who had once left Tangier alone now returned as a man whose footsteps circled much of the known world. In the quiet of his later days, Ibn Battuta would sometimes sit by a window, looking at the sea. The same waves he had watched as a young man now broke against the shore. But the man himself had changed. He had lived the dreams of many and left behind a gift that would never fade. When Ibn Battuta returned to Morocco and completed the dictation of his book, the echo of his journey did not stop at the Sultan's court. His words began to ripple outward, touching scholars, travelers, and ordinary people alike. Each listener found something different in his tale: adventure, knowledge, faith, or simply the comfort of a story told by a man who had truly seen the world. In marketplaces, his stories were repeated by merchants. They told of India's elephants covered in silk, of China's giant ships sailing across endless seas, of the Maldives' palm trees swaying above turquoise waters. Children, wide-eyed, listened as if the world itself were unfolding before them. In mosques and schools, scholars leaned closer, writing notes on the lands he described, lands that most of them would never set foot in. The Rihla, his great book of travels, became more than a personal record. It turned into a window to the wider world. To the people of Morocco, it showed the reach of their faith, spread across continents. To later generations, it revealed the networks of trade, the flow of knowledge, and the beauty of cultures woven together across the medieval world.
Ibn Battuta's words preserved images that might otherwise have been lost. The scholars teaching under the trees of Timbuktu, the bustling spice markets of Calicut, the gardens of Shiraz filled with poetry, the disciplined streets of Khanbalik, and the simple generosity of villagers in the Sahara. He captured not only monuments and landscapes, but also the heartbeat of daily life. Voices, gestures, meals, and prayers. For some, his account was a guide. Future travelers used his descriptions to plan their own journeys. For others, it was inspiration. Young men dreamed of following his footsteps, even if only in imagination. And for many, it was proof that the world, though vast, was connected by roads of faith, trade, and human curiosity. Centuries passed, yet his legacy remained alive. Historians studied his book to understand the medieval world. Geographers traced his paths to redraw maps. Writers retold his tales, shaping them into new forms for new audiences. His voice carried across languages and cultures, reminding all who heard it of the power of one man's footsteps. In his own time, Ibn Battuta may have seemed simply a traveler, returning home after years away. But history saw him differently. He became a bridge between worlds, a witness to the variety of human life, and a reminder that knowledge is not bound by walls, but grows with every journey. And so, even as he rested in Morocco, his story continued to travel, farther than his body ever could. His name became part of the great conversation of history, his legacy a light carried from one age to the next. Time passed, and the roads that once stretched endlessly before Ibn Battuta grew quiet. His days of wandering were over. No longer did he ride with caravans across the desert. No longer did he step aboard ships bound for distant lands. Instead, he walked slowly through the streets of Morocco, the place where his story had begun. He was no longer the young man who had stood on the shore of Tangier, gazing toward the horizon with a restless heart. His hair had grown white, his face lined with years of wind, sun, and worry. Yet his eyes still carried the spark of curiosity, the same light that had guided him across half the world. In his final years, Ibn Battuta found peace not in movement, but in memory. He spent his days surrounded by listeners, children eager for tales, merchants curious about faraway markets, scholars writing down his words. Each story he told was like a door opening to another world. When he spoke of India, people imagined the elephants and jeweled palaces. When he described China, they saw mighty ships and disciplined streets. When he recalled Mali, they heard the voices of scholars teaching under trees. Sometimes he sat quietly by a window, watching the sea. The same sea that had once carried him to Egypt, to India, to the Maldives, now simply rolled and whispered against the shore. He thought of the storms he had survived, the deserts he had crossed, the mountains he had climbed. He thought of the friends he had met and lost, of the countless faces that had filled his journey. His heart was heavy with memory, but also light with gratitude. The book of his travels was complete. The Rihla had captured his voice, his vision, his footsteps across the world. It was more than a record of where he had gone. It was a mirror of the age he lived in, a testimony to the reach of faith, trade, and human connection. He knew that when his body returned to the earth, his words would continue to live. One evening, as the sun sank low and the sky turned gold, he whispered a thought that had grown within him over the years. A man may leave his home and travel the world, but in the end, it is the story that remains.
The story is what walks on after the man is gone. Ibn Battuta passed away in Morocco, the land of his birth. His grave lay still, but his story did not. His name spread across generations, carried by his book, remembered by scholars, admired by travelers, retold by countless voices. Centuries later, his journey is still alive. Students read his words in classrooms. Historians trace his steps on maps. Travelers walk in his shadow, following paths he once crossed. To many, he remains the greatest traveler of the medieval world, a man whose feet carried him farther than most could dream. Thus ended the road of Ibn Battuta. But in truth, it was not an end. It was the beginning of immortality. For as long as his story is told, his footsteps will never fade, and his journey will never truly be over.